The temperature read -18 degrees Fahrenheit. 23 recruits stood at the firing line, their fingers cramping inside their $500 tactical gloves. One by one, they stepped back from their positions, unable to squeeze their triggers. But at Station 14, a 67-year-old man with a worn leather glove on his shooting hand continued firing. His groupings remained tight, his hands remained steady. The same recruits who had laughed at his equipment 4 hours earlier now stared in disbelief. One of them, a former college athlete who had mocked the old man's glove the loudest, couldn't even feel his trigger finger anymore. The medic was already treating him for early-stage frostbite. If you believe that experience deserves respect, comment the word wisdom right now and stay until the end, because what this instructor knew about leather, cold and shooting would save careers that day and change everything these young men thought they understood about gear. Master Sergeant Raymond Coulter had been teaching marksmanship at the Mountain Warfare Training Facility in northern Wyoming for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 26 years in the United States Army, including 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to locations he still wasn't permitted to discuss. He had earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. He had trained snipers who went on to become legends in special operations communities. He had written portions of the cold weather shooting manual that the Army still used. But none of the recruits standing at the range that February morning knew any of this. What they saw was an old man with grey hair, weathered skin, and a single leather glove that looked like it belonged in a museum. The glove was dark brown, almost black in places from years of use. The leather had a strange shine to it, not glossy like new leather, but deep, like it had absorbed something over decades of service. Coulter wore it only on his right hand, his shooting hand, leaving his left hand in a standard-issue cold-weather mitten. The recruits had arrived the previous evening fresh from their initial training phase. They were young, fit and confident. Most of them came from backgrounds where technology solved every problem. Their gear reflected this philosophy. They wore the latest generation of tactical cold-weather gloves, featuring synthetic insulation rated to -40 degrees, moisture-wicking liners, and touchscreen-compatible fingertips. Several had spent their own money upgrading to even more expensive options, gloves with battery-powered heating elements and carbon fiber reinforcements. They looked at Coulter's single leather glove the way someone might look at a rotary phone in an Apple store. Private First Class Derek Simmons was the first to say something. He nudged the recruit next to him and nodded toward the instructor. "Looks like Grandpa forgot to update his Amazon cart," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Laughter rippled through the group. Another recruit, Specialist Tanya Vickers, added, "Maybe someone should start a GoFundMe for proper equipment." More laughter. Coulter heard every word. His expression didn't change. He simply checked his rifle, adjusted his position, and waited for the session to begin. The morning started cold but manageable, around 5 degrees above zero. The recruits performed well initially, their expensive gloves keeping their hands warm during the first 2 hours of shooting drills. They cycled through various positions, practiced magazine changes, and worked on their breathing techniques. Throughout these exercises, several continued making comments about Coulter's glove. They noticed that his movements seemed slower than theirs during reloads. They noticed that his glove didn't have the sleek appearance of modern tactical gear. What they didn't notice was that his shooting was flawless. Every round found its mark. Every grouping was textbook perfect. They were too focused on appearance to observe performance. By noon, the temperature had dropped to -8 degrees. This was when the facility's true purpose revealed itself. Mountain warfare training wasn't about comfort. It was about survival and function, in conditions that broke equipment and broke people. The afternoon session would push everyone to their limits. What the recruits didn't understand, what most people never learn, is that Frostbite doesn't announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, a thief that steals sensation before it steals tissue. The process begins when blood vessels near the skin's surface constrict in response to cold, redirecting blood to the body's core to protect vital organs. This reduced blood flow leaves extremities vulnerable. The fingers, with their high surface area-to-volume ratio and distance from the heart, are among the first casualties. In the earlier stage, called frostnip, the skin becomes pale and feels prickly or numb. Many people dismiss this as simple cold. They flex their fingers, blow on their hands, and continue what they're doing. This is a critical mistake. Once frostnip progresses to superficial frostbite, ice crystals begin forming in the skin tissue. The affected area may appear deceptively normal or slightly waxy. Pain often diminishes as nerve damage begins, creating a dangerous false sense of improvement. Deep frostbite, the most severe form, occurs when ice crystals form not just in the skin but in deeper tissues, including muscles and tendons. At this stage, the damage can be permanent. Fingers have been lost to moments of pride, to the belief that expensive gear provides absolute protection. The modern tactical gloves the recruits wore operated on a simple principle: trap body heat using synthetic insulation while blocking external cold. This works remarkably well in many conditions. However, these gloves share a fundamental vulnerability. They rely on passive insulation, meaning they depend entirely on the body's heat production to maintain temperature. When a shooter remains stationary for extended periods, when they're prone in the snow waiting for a target, when they're standing at a fixed position cycling through slow fire exercises, their body produces less heat. Simultaneously, the metal components of their rifles become heat sinks, actively drawing warmth away from their hands with every contact. The synthetic materials in modern gloves, despite their impressive ratings, also share another weakness. They don't breathe as effectively as natural materials when moisture becomes a factor. And moisture always becomes a factor. Even in extreme cold, hands sweat. That moisture gets trapped inside synthetic gloves, and when the body's heat production decreases, that moisture accelerates heat loss through evaporative cooling. This is precisely what began happening to the recruits 3 hours into the afternoon session. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees. A light wind had developed, pushing the wind chill to -28. Private Simmons, the recruit who had made the Amazon joke that morning, was the first to report problems. He approached the range safety officer and admitted he was having difficulty feeling his trigger finger. His expensive gloves, with their touchscreen-compatible fingertips, had thinner material at precisely the point where he needed the most protection. The thin spots allowed heat to escape and cold to penetrate directly to his shooting finger. Within the next 30 minutes, 6 more recruits reported similar issues. Some had moisture build-up inside their gloves that had begun to freeze. Others had compression points where the glove material stretched tight over knuckles provided inadequate insulation. The battery-powered heated gloves had become a particular problem. The batteries affected by the cold had drained faster than expected, leaving their users dependent on dead weight attached to their hands. The range medic began cycling through the recruits, assessing for frostbite and treating early cases with controlled rewarming. What had started as a marksmanship session was becoming a medical event. Throughout this crisis, Master Sergeant Coulter remained at his station. His breathing was steady. His position was perfect. His rounds continued finding their targets with mechanical precision. The recruits who weren't being treated began watching him with different eyes. They noticed that he occasionally removed his leather glove, not to warm his hand, but to briefly expose it to the air before putting the glove back on. They noticed that his movements, which had seemed slow that morning, were actually deliberate and consistent, exactly the same speed regardless of how long he'd been shooting. Specialist Vickers, the one who had suggested the GoFundMe, approached him during a brief break in firing. "Sergeant," she said, her voice stripped of the morning sarcasm, "how are you doing that? How is your hand still working?" Coulter looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Leather," he said simply. "Properly maintained." Vickers shook her head, not understanding. "My gloves are rated to -40. Yours can't possibly be better." Coulter's weathered face cracked into the first smile any of them had seen. "Your gloves are rated by engineers in a laboratory. Mine were proven in places where ratings meant nothing." The story of that glove, when Coulter finally told it, would explain everything. But first, he did something unexpected. He called a temporary halt to the exercise and gathered all the recruits who were still functional. The medic had transported 3 of them back to the main facility for treatment. The remaining 20 stood in a semicircle around the old instructor, their expensive gear failing them, their fingers aching or numb, their confidence shattered. "What you're experiencing," Coulter began, his voice carrying easily despite the wind, "is the difference between specification and reality. Your gloves are technological marvels. They were designed using computer models and tested under controlled conditions. They work perfectly in those conditions. But combat doesn't happen in controlled conditions. Mountain warfare doesn't happen in controlled conditions. Life doesn't happen in controlled conditions." He held up his leather glove, the one they had mocked that morning. This glove is 53 years old. It was made in 1971 by a company that doesn't exist anymore. The original owner was a Marine Corps sniper named Thomas Whitmore, who served 3 tours in Vietnam and later became an instructor at this facility, back when it was run by a different branch. He was my mentor. He taught me everything about shooting in impossible conditions. When he passed in 2012, he left me this glove and the knowledge of how to maintain it. The recruits listened in silence as Coulter explained the science that made his ancient glove superior to their modern equipment. Traditional leather, he told them, works fundamentally differently than synthetic materials. When properly treated and maintained, leather becomes what's called conditioned, a process that involves repeatedly working oils and waxes into the material over years. This conditioning creates a unique microstructure within the leather fibers. The oils don't just sit on the surface. They integrate into the collagen matrix of the leather itself, creating a material that actually insulates better when it absorbs slight amounts of moisture rather than worse. This is the opposite of synthetic materials. Additionally, leather has natural breathability that prevents the moisture buildup that plagued their tactical gloves. The material allows water vapor to escape while still blocking wind and retaining heat. But the most important factor was something that couldn't be replicated by modern manufacturing. Leather molds to the wearer's hand over time. Coulter's glove had molded to his hand over 11 years of use, with that 53 years of previous conditioning and wear creating a base that was already perfect when he inherited it. There were no pressure points, no tight spots, no areas where insulation was compromised by stretching. The specific treatment Coulter used was a closely guarded method passed down from instructor to instructor at the facility. It involved a mixture of mink oil, beeswax, and a small amount of neat's foot oil, applied in thin layers and worked into the leather by hand over multiple sessions. The process had to be repeated monthly during regular use, and weekly during intensive cold weather periods. But it wasn't just about the materials. The application method mattered enormously. The oils had to be warmed slightly, not heated but brought to just above room temperature, and then massaged into the leather using circular motions that pushed the conditioning agents deep into the fibers. After application, the glove had to be worn while it absorbed the treatment, allowing body heat and movement to complete the conditioning process. Most people who tried to replicate this technique failed because they treated leather care as a chore rather than a relationship. They slathered on product, let it sit, and wiped off the excess. That approach would make leather water resistant and somewhat softer, but it wouldn't create the deep conditioning that made extreme cold weather performance possible. The glove had to be maintained with attention, consistency, and respect. The educational portion complete, Coulter then did something that truly surprised the recruits. He removed a small leather pouch from his cargo pocket and handed it to specialist Vickers. That contains enough treatment compound for one application to a standard leather shooting glove, he said. There's a supply sergeant at the main facility who has a box of old leather gloves that were due to be disposed of. They're not pretty, they're not tactical, they don't have touchscreen compatible fingertips, but they're real leather, and they can be conditioned. He looked at the group, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. You have a choice. You can write this off as an old man's eccentricity. You can go back to your barracks, file a complaint about your equipment, and wait for the supply chain to send you newer, shinier synthetic gloves that will fail you again in the same conditions. Or you can learn. He paused, letting the wind carry his words. The military teaches you to adapt and overcome. Sometimes that means embracing technology. Sometimes it means understanding why the old ways survived long enough to become old ways. That evening, 17 of the remaining 20 recruits made their way to the supply sergeant Coulter had mentioned. They found the box of old leather gloves, a collection of various sizes and conditions that had been sitting in a storage room for nearly a decade. The gloves were stiff, dusty, and unloved, but they were real leather, and they were free for the taking. Specialist Vickers organized the group, distributing the treatment compound and teaching the technique as Coulter had explained it. They worked late into the night, conditioning the neglected leather with the patience and attention the process required. Not everyone's technique was perfect. Not every glove would achieve the level of conditioning that Coulter's possessed, but they were learning. They were adapting. They were doing what soldiers had done for centuries when faced with challenges their equipment couldn't meet. They were solving problems with knowledge, effort, and humility. Private Simmons, his frostbitten finger bandaged, worked longer than anyone else. He had the most to prove, and perhaps the most to learn. 3 days later, The advanced cold weather shooting qualification resumed. The temperature was -12 degrees, slightly warmer than the day that had defeated them. The recruits returned to the range with their newly conditioned leather gloves. Some wore them confidently. Others were skeptical, still half believing that technology had to be superior to tradition. But as the hours passed, something remarkable became clear. The recruits with properly conditioned leather were performing better than they had with their expensive tactical gear. Their fingers remained nimble, their groupings improved. Their confidence grew as they realized that a $50 leather glove, properly maintained, could outperform a $500 synthetic marvel. Not everyone passed the qualification that day. Some recruits had started the conditioning process too late, and their gloves hadn't yet reached optimal performance. A few had applied the treatment incorrectly and created a greasy mess that actually made their grip worse. But the majority passed, and more importantly, the majority learned. They learned that equipment ratings were starting points, not guarantees. They learned that maintenance was as important as acquisition. They learned that sometimes the wisdom of previous generations contained solutions that modern engineering hadn't yet replicated. Master Sergeant Raymond Coulter stood at the same station where he had stood during the crisis. His leather glove, 53 years old and still perfect, remained on his shooting hand. As the qualification ended, several recruits approached to thank him. Specialist Vickers spoke for the group. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology. When I saw your glove that first morning, I thought you were holding on to the past because you couldn't keep up with the present. I was wrong." Coulter shook his head slowly. "You weren't entirely wrong. I am holding on to the past, but not because I can't keep up. I'm holding on to it because some things from the past deserve to survive. Thomas Whitmore gave me this glove and the knowledge that came with it. Someday I'll pass both to someone worthy. The glove itself will eventually wear out, maybe in another 50 years, maybe sooner. But the knowledge won't wear out if it's passed on." He looked at the recruits, these young people who had arrived so confident and left so changed. In your careers, you'll encounter new equipment, new technology, new solutions to old problems. Most of them will be genuine improvements, but some of them will be improvements only on paper, in laboratories, under controlled conditions. Your job is to know the difference. Your job is to test everything in real conditions and trust your own experience over anyone's rating. The story of that February training session spread through the mountain warfare community. It became one of those tales that instructors shared with new classes, that veterans mentioned when the topic of gear came up, that appeared in informal discussions about cold weather operations. The facility supply sergeant reported that his entire stock of old leather gloves had been claimed within a month of the incident, and he had to request more from other installations. A small group of recruits, those who had been present that day, began maintaining and passing down the leather glove tradition to each subsequent class. The treatment compound recipe was written down and posted in the facility's unofficial knowledge board, a corkboard in the recreation room where hard-won wisdom was shared outside official channels. Private Simmons, whose frostbitten finger healed completely thanks to quick medical treatment, became one of the most vocal advocates for the leather glove method. He completed his training, served 2 deployments, and eventually returned to the mountain warfare facility as a junior instructor. His first lecture to new recruits included the story of how he had mocked an old man's equipment and learned a lesson that no amount of money could have purchased. Master Sergeant Coulter retired 2 years after that incident at age 69. He had trained thousands of soldiers over his career, taught marksmanship to some of the most elite operators in the United States military, and contributed to doctrine that would influence cold weather operations for generations. But when asked about his legacy, he always returned to the same theme: respect for knowledge, wherever it comes from. In his retirement speech, attended by former students who had travelled from across the country, he said something that became another piece of wisdom passed down through the facility's unofficial channels. Every generation thinks they've figured out what previous generations got wrong. Sometimes they're right. Technology advances, understanding deepens, mistakes get corrected. But arrogance blinds us to the solutions that previous generations got right. The leather glove on my hand isn't better than modern alternatives because old things are automatically good. It's better because someone 60 years ago solved a problem perfectly and we forgot to keep that solution alive. Our job isn't to worship the past or worship the future. Our job is to find what works and keep it working. After his retirement, Coulter passed the leather glove to Specialist Vickers, who by then had become Sergeant First Class Vickers. She maintains it to this day, using the same treatment, the same technique, the same respect that every previous owner gave it. The glove is now 64 years old and still performing perfectly. The lesson of that frozen February goes beyond leather and shooting and military training. It speaks to something fundamental about knowledge and humility, and the dangerous assumption that newer always means better. Modern technology solves countless problems and improves countless lives. It would be foolish to reject advancement out of nostalgia. But it would be equally foolish to reject proven solutions simply because they don't look modern, don't come with impressive specifications, don't match our assumptions about progress. The recruits who laughed at an old man's leather glove learned this lesson the hard way, through frostbitten fingers and failed qualifications. But they learned it, and they passed it on. And somewhere right now, a young soldier is carefully conditioning a leather shooting glove with a mixture of mink oil, beeswax, and neat's foot oil, preparing for conditions where specifications mean nothing, and only results matter. That is how wisdom survives. That is how experience outlives the people who earned it. And that is why sometimes the oldest solution in the room is also the best. If you believe that real knowledge deserves to be preserved and passed down, subscribe to my channel, where every story honors the wisdom that deserves to survive.